Jake's hands trembled as he watched Elena rise from her chair, her movements uncertain yet drawn by something she'd never experienced before. The music box sat on their rough-hewn table, its melody weaving through the dust-heavy air like a silver thread. Samuel stood motionless beside it, his small fingers still gripping the brass key, his dark eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made Jake's skin prickle. Elena's hand moved to her throat, her fingers pressing against the hollow there, as if she could feel the vibrations of the mysterious tune. Jake had seen her do this before when the cattle lowed or when thunder shook the house, but this was different. Her face held wonder instead of confusion, recognition instead of the patient resignation she usually wore when the world moved around her in silence. The boy, Samuel, if that was truly his name, couldn't be more than 8 years old. His clothes were strange, too fine for a drifter's child, with intricate embroidery along the collar that spoke of distant places. No dust clung to him despite the storm that had raged for hours, and his skin held a pallor that suggested he'd never worked under the brutal Texas sun. "Where did you come from, son?" Jake's voice emerged as a whisper, careful not to disturb whatever spell was unfolding before him. The boy's lips remained sealed, but his eyes shifted to Jake with a look far too old for his young face. The melody began to wind down, its final notes hanging in the air like dying echoes. Elena's expression shifted to something approaching panic, and she stepped toward the music box with her hands outstretched. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with the memory of something extraordinary. Elena's hands moved in the familiar patterns of their shared language, her gestures quick and urgent more. "Please, what was that?" Jake translated for the boy, though he suspected Samuel understood more than he let on. "She wants to hear it again." Samuel's small hand moved to the key once more, and Jake noticed the tremor in the child's fingers, as if each winding cost him something. When the melody resumed, Elena sank into the nearest chair, her hands pressed flat against her chest, her eyes closed in concentration. The music was unlike anything Jake had ever heard, haunting and beautiful, but with an underlying current that made his spine tighten with unease. It seemed to pull at something deep inside him, stirring memories he couldn't quite grasp and longings he'd never acknowledged. How much more powerful must it be for Elena, hearing sound for the first time? Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, and sand pelted the windows like rifle shot. The storm showed no signs of abating, which meant the boy would be staying the night whether Jake liked it or not. And truth be told, he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Everything about Samuel felt wrong and miraculous in equal measure. When the music stopped again, Elena opened her eyes and looked directly at Jake. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately. I heard it. Inside my head, in my chest. Is this what sound is like? Jake's throat constricted. How could he explain the gift she'd just experienced when he barely understood it himself? He'd grown up with the symphony of ranch life, horses whinnying, cattle calling, the creak of saddle leather, the whisper of wind through grass. For Elena, the world had always been a silent movie, beautiful but incomplete. Yes, he signed back. That sound. Music. Samuel suddenly swayed on his feet, and Jake lunged forward to catch him before he collapsed. The boy weighed almost nothing, and his skin was cold despite the warm air in the house. Up close, Jake could see the exhaustion etched in the child's features, as if maintaining whatever magic lived in that box had drained him. "Elena, help me get him to the spare room," Jake said, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear his words. But she was already moving, her maternal instincts activated by the sight of a child in distress. As they settled Samuel onto the narrow bed, Jake caught sight of something that made his blood chill. The boy's wrists bore faint scars, thin white lines that looked like shackles had once bound them. What kind of life had this child lived? And why did Jake have the unsettling feeling that Samuel's arrival wasn't coincidence but destiny? Elena touched Jake's shoulder and signed a question that pierced straight to his heart. Will he stay? Will he bring the music back? Jake looked down at the sleeping boy, so small and fragile, yet carrying something that defied every law of nature Jake knew. The music box sat silent on the table in the next room, but its presence seemed to pulse through the house like a second heartbeat. Outside, the storm raged on, as if the very heavens were protesting the miracle that had just unfolded in their simple ranch house. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the wind and sand, Jake sensed that larger forces were stirring, forces that would soon demand payment for the gift they'd witnessed tonight. He had no idea how steep that price would be. Dawn crept through the shutters like a cautious animal, casting amber strips across the spare room where Samuel slept. Jake had been awake for hours, sitting in the kitchen with cold coffee growing bitter in his cup, watching the boy's door and trying to convince himself that last night had been real. The music box sat before him on the table, its ornate surface catching the early light, beautiful and silent and impossible. Elena emerged from their bedroom, her hand trailing along the wall in the way she did each morning, reading the house's vibrations for signs of life and movement. She wore the blue dress he'd bought her for their wedding 3 years ago, the one that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Her pregnancy was just beginning to show, a gentle curve beneath the fabric that filled Jake with equal measures of joy and terror. She moved to him and placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch asking the question she didn't need to sign. He pointed toward Samuel's room and nodded. Still here, still real. The music, she signed, her movements hesitant, as if she feared the memory might dissolve under examination. Will I hear it again? Jake captured her hands in his, pressing them against his chest where his heart hammered with uncertainty. He had no answer to give her. The boy was a mystery, and mysteries in Jake's experience rarely came without a price attached. The morning routine began as it always did. Jake pulled on his boots and hat, checked his rifle, and stepped onto the porch to survey the Morrison Ranch spread below. 2,000 acres of scrubland and stubborn cattle, inherited from his father along with debts that grew heavier each year. The drought had been merciless, turning the grass brittle and the creek beds to cracked earth. The cattle clustered around the few remaining waterholes, their ribs showing through dusty hides. His foreman duties would normally take him out before sunrise, but today felt different. Today he was reluctant to leave Elena alone with the strange boy and his impossible gift. What if Samuel vanished while Jake was gone? What if he played that haunting melody again and something went wrong? Elena appeared beside him, carrying the coffee pot and 2 cups. She'd learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw worked when worry gnawed at him. Her free hand signed a gentle rebuke. Go. Work. I'll watch the boy. The cattle wouldn't tend themselves, and the Hendersons' prize bull needed collecting from the north pasture. Jake had promised to have it back by noon, and his reputation for reliability was one of the few assets the ranch still possessed. He kissed Elena's forehead, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair, and mounted his gelding. The ride to the north pasture took him through the heart of their struggle. Fence posts stood like grave markers in the barren landscape, and the windmill that should have been pumping water for the stock turned listlessly in the weak breeze. Each hoofbeat reminded him of what he stood to lose, not just the ranch, but the life he'd built here with Elena, the future they'd planned for their child. He'd met Elena 4 years ago at the church social in Redemption Falls, drawn by her grace and the way she seemed to see the world more clearly than anyone else, despite her deafness. She'd been working as a seamstress then, her delicate hands creating beauty from scraps of fabric. Jake had learned to sign just to court her, spending hours practicing until his clumsy fingers could shape the words his heart needed to say. Their wedding had been simple, held in the ranch house parlor with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Elena had worn wildflowers in her hair and signed her vows with tears streaming down her cheeks. Jake had promised to be her voice in the hearing world and her shelter in every storm. But he'd never imagined a storm like the one brewing now. The Henderson bull was exactly where Jake expected to find him, standing knee-deep in the last muddy pool of what used to be Willow Creek. The animal came docilely enough, but as they made their way back toward the ranch house, Jake found his attention divided between the trail and the questions multiplying in his mind. Samuel's scars haunted him. Someone had chained that boy, treated him like property. The music box was clearly ancient, its wood bearing the patina of centuries. How had a child come to possess something so obviously valuable? And why did Jake feel like invisible eyes were watching him even now, measuring and judging his worthiness? As the ranch house came into view, Jake saw Elena on the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she watched for his return. Even at this distance, he could read the tension in her posture. Something had happened while he was gone. He spurred the gelding forward, the bull forgotten behind him, his heart racing with the certainty that their ordinary world, the world they'd built together with love and hope and stubborn determination, was about to change forever. Jake reached the porch in a cloud of dust, dismounting before his gelding had fully stopped. Elena's face was pale, her hands moving in rapid, agitated gestures that made his stomach clench with dread. Men came, she signed, her movements sharp with fear. 3 riders. They asked about the boy. What men? Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. He glanced toward the spare room where the door stood open, revealing an empty bed. Where's Samuel? Hidden. In the root cellar. Elena's eyes were wide. The same look she'd worn during their first winter together when wolves had circled the house for 3 nights running. They knew about him, Jake. They knew his name. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Samuel wasn't just some lost child who'd wandered into their lives by accident. Someone was hunting him, and that someone had resources enough to track him across the wasteland of drought-stricken Texas. Elena led him inside, her hand gripping his arm with desperate strength. The music box still sat on the kitchen table, but now it seemed less like a miracle and more like evidence of a crime Jake didn't understand. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught its surface, revealing details he hadn't noticed before. Symbols, carved into the wood that looked like no writing he'd ever seen. They said they were his guardians, Elena continued, her signing becoming more controlled as she relayed the encounter. But their eyes were wrong. Cold. Like men who burn things. Jake felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip, suddenly aware of how exposed the ranch house was, how far they were from any help. What did you tell them? Nothing. I pointed to my ears and shook my head. They thought I was simple. A flash of anger crossed her features at the memory. One of them started to search the house, but the leader stopped him. Said they'd be back with papers. Papers. That meant law, or at least the pretense of it. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities, none of them comforting. If Samuel was valuable enough to pursue across state lines, then the music box was likely worth more than Jake's entire ranch. But wealth that fell from the sky usually came with blood on it. A soft sound from the direction of the root cellar made them both turn. Samuel emerged from the narrow doorway like a ghost, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling on Jake's face. The boy moved to the music box and placed his small hands on its surface, his expression grave beyond his years. They're coming back, aren't they? Jake said, though he knew Samuel wouldn't answer with words. The boy nodded once, a movement so slight it might have been imagined. Elena stepped forward and knelt before Samuel, her hands moving in gentle signs that Jake had taught her for speaking with children. Are you safe with us? She asked. Do you want to stay? Samuel's response surprised them both. He reached for Elena's hands and guided them to the music box, then looked directly into her eyes and nodded with fierce determination. The message was clear. The music, the miracle of Elena's hearing, was worth whatever danger followed in its wake. But Jake wasn't so sure. He'd built his life on practical things, honest work, careful planning, the kind of steady progress that came from getting up before dawn and falling into bed exhausted each night. Magic belonged in children's stories, not in the harsh reality of mortgage payments and failing crops. Yet, as he watched Elena's face transform with hope, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. She had heard music for the first time in her life. Their unborn child would grow up in a world where its mother could hear lullabies, could hear its first words, could hear the sound of rain on the roof that had always been just another silent vibration to her. How could he weigh that miracle against the threat of unknown men with cold eyes and legal papers? The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made the decision for him. Elena's hand flew to her throat, and Jake realized with a shock that she had heard the approaching riders, actually heard them. The music box was still changing her, expanding the gift it had given her. "A root cellar," Jake said, but Samuel shook his head and moved toward the front window. The boy peered through the glass, then turned back with an expression that chilled Jake's blood. Running wouldn't work this time. Jake looked at his wife, at the child she carried, at the mysterious boy who had brought wonder and terror in equal measure into their lives. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, carrying with them the weight of choice. He could surrender Samuel, protect Elena and their unborn child, return to their quiet life of struggle and hope. Or he could fight for the miracle, knowing that some prices were paid in blood. Elena's hands found his, her touch carrying all the love they'd built together and all the dreams they'd shared. Her eyes held a question that would define the rest of their lives. What was he willing to risk for the impossible? The riders were almost at the door. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the porch, followed by the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his Colt, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. Through the window he could see 3 figures dismounting, 2 tall men in dark suits and a third in the brown uniform of a territorial marshal. The sight of that badge made his blood turn to ice water. "Stay behind me," Jake whispered to Elena, forgetting again that she could hear him now. The wonder in her eyes as she processed his words almost broke his heart. How many simple phrases had he wanted to speak to her over the years, never imagining she might someday hear them. Samuel moved away from the window and positioned himself beside the music box, his small hands hovering over its surface like a pianist preparing for a difficult piece. The boy's dark eyes held a knowledge that no child should possess, the understanding of what it meant to be hunted. A sharp rap echoed through the house. "Morrison, we know you're in there. We need to talk." The voice carried authority and barely controlled impatience. Jake glanced at Elena, whose face had gone pale at the sound. She was still adjusting to this new world of noise, where threats could arrive through the air itself, instead of just through sight and vibration. "What do I do?" Jake's whisper was meant for himself, but Elena heard it and placed her hand on his arm. The touch steadied him, reminded him of what he'd sworn to protect when he'd married her. But Samuel was just a child, and children deserved protection too. Another knock, harder this time. "Don't make this difficult, Morrison. We have legal authority here." Legal authority. Jake had seen what passed for law in some parts of Texas, where badges could be bought and papers forged. But even legitimate law could be twisted when enough money backed it. And something told him that whoever wanted Samuel had resources that dwarfed anything Jake could imagine. Elena's hands moved in quick, urgent signs. What if they take him? What if the music stops forever? The question cut through Jake like a blade. He'd lived 32 years in a world full of sound, taking for granted every horse's whinny, every whisper of wind through grass, every word of love he'd ever heard. Elena had experienced less than a day of that world, and already she understood what losing it would mean. But their child. Jake's hand moved unconsciously to Elena's belly, where new life grew beneath her heart. What kind of father would he be if he brought violence to their doorstep? What if stray bullets found their mark? What if Elena was hurt trying to protect Samuel? "I could give him up," Jake said, the words bitter as alkali water. "Tell them he just wandered in during the storm. That we don't know anything about the music box." Samuel turned at the sound of his voice, and Jake saw something in the boy's expression that made him feel smaller than dust. It wasn't accusation or fear, but a terrible kind of understanding, as if Samuel had been betrayed before and had learned to expect it. Elena moved to Samuel and knelt beside him, her hands signing gentle reassurances. But her eyes, when they met Jake's, held a question that shook him to his core. What kind of man abandons a child to save himself? The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of boots circling the house. They were looking for another way in, or checking for escape routes. Professional hunters then, not just opportunists with legal papers. "Morrison," The voice came from the back of the house now. "We can do this easy, or we can do it hard. The boy belongs to us, and we're not leaving without him." Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each one bleaker than the last. He could fight, but 3 armed men against 1 was poor odds even for someone of his size and experience. He could try to bargain, but what did he have that men with territorial marshals in their pocket might want? The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt, and his reputation was his only real asset. Elena stood and moved to the music box, her fingers tracing its carved surface with reverent care. When she looked at Jake again, her signing was slow and deliberate. "This is bigger than us. The music, it's not just for me. There are others who need it. Others who need it." Jake hadn't considered that possibility, but it made terrible sense. If the box could give hearing to Elena, what other miracles might it contain? What other lives might it change? And what would happen to those possibilities if Samuel fell into the hands of men who saw him as property to be owned, rather than a child to be protected? The sound of splintering wood came from the kitchen door. They were out of time for doubt, out of moments for hesitation. Jake looked at his wife, at the boy who had brought impossible music into their lives, at the music box that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. His hand settled on the grip of his Colt, and Jake Morrison made his choice. The kitchen door exploded inward with a crash that made Elena flinch, another sound she was still learning to process. Jake drew his Colt in one fluid motion, the familiar weight of the gun steadying his nerves as 3 figures filled the doorway. The man in front wore the marshal's badge, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a hired gun. Behind him, 2 men in expensive suits flanked the entrance, their hands resting on holstered weapons. The leader's gaze swept the room before settling on Samuel with unmistakable satisfaction. "There's our lost lamb," the marshal said, his voice carrying a false warmth that made Jake's skin crawl. "Samuel, boy, you've led us quite a chase." Samuel pressed closer to the music box, his small frame trembling, but his jaw set with determination that reminded Jake of Elena when she'd first told him she wanted to learn to shoot. The boy's silence seemed to irritate the marshal, whose smile tightened at the edges. "Now, Morrison," the man continued, his attention shifting to Jake, "you've got 2 choices here. Hand over the boy and his property, and we'll be on our way. Nobody gets hurt, and you can go back to your quiet life. And if I refuse—" Jake's voice was steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Well, then we exercise our legal authority." The marshal's hand moved to his own weapon. "The boy's a runaway ward of the state, and that music box is stolen property. Interfering with the law is a serious charge, especially for a man with a pregnant wife to consider." The threat hit its mark, but instead of fear, Jake felt something else rising in his chest, a fury he hadn't experienced since his father's death. These men had come into his home, threatened his family, and spoken of Samuel like he was livestock to be collected. Elena's hand suddenly gripped his arm. She was staring at Samuel, her face pale with shock. The boy was backing away from the music box, his movements jerky with terror, but there was something else, resignation. He was preparing to surrender himself. In that moment, Jake saw his own father's face in his memory. The old man had been dying of consumption, but he'd still tried to work the ranch, still fought for every acre and every head of cattle right up until his last breath. "A man protects what's his," he'd told Jake the night before he died. "And sometimes what's yours ain't about ownership. It's about what's right." Samuel wasn't his son, wasn't his blood, wasn't even really his responsibility. But the boy had wandered into their lives during a storm, seeking shelter, and Jake had given it. In his father's book, that made Samuel family until he chose to leave. "Here's my counteroffer," Jake said, raising his Colt until it pointed directly at the marshal's chest. "You gentlemen mount up and ride away. The boy stays until he decides otherwise." The marshal's laugh was ugly. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. We've got the law on our side." "Maybe," Jake replied. "But I've got the high ground, and you're standing in my kitchen. You really want to test whether that badge stops bullets?" The tension stretched taut as a wire fence. Elena moved slowly toward Samuel, her hand signing reassurances that the boy might not understand but would hopefully feel. Her presence seemed to strengthen him, and Jake felt a surge of pride at his wife's courage. "Besides," Jake continued, his voice growing harder, "something tells me that badge of yours wouldn't stand up to close inspection. Real marshals don't usually travel in groups to collect runaway children." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the leader's face, confirming Jake's suspicion. These men might have legal papers, but their authority was as fake as a wooden nickel. Samuel suddenly stepped forward, placing himself between the men and the music box. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but in the charged silence it carried like a shout. "I won't go back." The words seemed to cost him everything, as if speaking them had torn something vital from his chest, but they transformed the room. Elena gasped, actually hearing the boy's voice for the first time. The marshal's face darkened with rage at this unexpected defiance, and Jake Morrison felt the last of his doubts burn away like morning mist. "You heard him," Jake said. "The boy's made his choice." Elena moved to stand beside Jake, her own hand finding the shotgun they kept by the door. She couldn't aim it properly yet. Her world of sound was still too new, but her message was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The marshal's hand twitched toward his gun, and Jake knew they had crossed the threshold. There would be no quiet life after this, no return to their simple existence of drought and debt and daily survival. They had chosen the miracle, chosen the boy, chosen to stand against whatever forces had been hunting him. The old world was gone. Whatever came next would demand everything they had to give. The standoff stretched like a held breath until the marshal's calculating eyes shifted to something beyond Jake's shoulder. A new sound, the thunder of multiple horses approaching fast, made everyone freeze. Through the broken door, dust clouds revealed at least 6 riders cresting the hill that led to the Morrison ranch. "Expecting company?" the marshal asked, but his confidence had cracked like dried leather. Jake's mind raced. He wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare enough that 6 riders meant either salvation or catastrophe. Elena's grip tightened on the shotgun as she strained to process these new sounds: hoofbeats, creaking saddles, the jingle of gear that announced armed men. Samuel suddenly moved to the music box and cranked its handle. The haunting melodies spilled into the room, and Elena's face transformed with wonder, even as the tension ratcheted higher. But the boy wasn't playing it for her this time. His eyes were fixed on the approaching riders, with something that might have been hope. "Damn," one of the fake marshal's companions cursed. "Someone's coming fast." The lead rider burst into view through the kitchen window, a woman in men's clothing, her graying hair whipping behind her as she leaned low over her horse's neck. She rode like she was born in the saddle, and the rifle across her back wasn't for show. Behind her came 5 men who looked like they'd stepped out of Jake's worst nightmares about range wars, hard-faced, well-armed, and moving with the coordination of a military unit. "Mrs. Garrett," Samuel whispered, his voice carrying relief so pure it made Jake's chest tighten. The woman, Mrs. Garrett, dismounted before her horse had fully stopped and strode toward the house with lethal purpose. Her boots rang against the porch boards like gunshots. "Samuel Morrison," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You step away from those men right now." Jake felt Elena's confusion through their linked hands. The woman had called Samuel by their name, as if he belonged to their family. But there was no time to puzzle it out. Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway with her rifle leveled at the fake marshal's head. "Ezra Blackwood," she said, her tone carrying the same warmth most people reserved for rattlesnakes. "Figured I'd find you sniffing around here eventually." The Marshal, Blackwood, tried to maintain his facade. "This is official business, Margaret. The boy's a ward of the state." "The boy's under my protection," Mrs. Garrett replied. "And you know it." Her eyes found Jake's, sharp as flint but not unkind. "You must be Jake Morrison." "I'm Margaret Garrett. I run the Safe House Network 2 counties over." "Safe House Network." Jake felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Samuel wasn't just a lost child. He was part of something larger, something that required networks and protection and armed riders in the night. Samuel wrote to me about the music, Mrs. Garrett continued, never taking her rifle off Blackwood. Said he'd found people who understood what it meant. Her gaze shifted to Elena, who was listening with rapt attention to every word. Said there was a woman who could hear for the first time. Elena's hands moved in signs that Jake translated without thinking. She wants to know if you're here to take Samuel away too. Mrs. Garrett's expression softened. I'm here to give him choices, ma'am. Same as I give all the children who find their way to me. She looked directly at Samuel. You want to come back to the safe house, son? Or you want to stay here with these folks who stood up for you? Samuel's response surprised everyone. He moved to Elena and took her hand, then reached for Jake's weathered fingers with his other small hand. The gesture was unmistakable. He was choosing them, choosing to stay, choosing to make this strange new family real. Blackwood's patience finally snapped. This is all very touching, but the boy has something that doesn't belong to him. That music box is worth more than this entire ranch, and my employer wants it back. Your employer, Mrs. Garrett said with contempt, is the same snake oil salesman who's been buying children with unusual gifts for the last decade. Well, that stops here. Jake's blood chilled. Buying children. He looked at Samuel with new understanding. The boy hadn't just been running from guardians, but from something far worse. Someone who collected children like Samuel, who saw their gifts as commodities to be owned and exploited. Elena, Jake said quietly, knowing she could hear him now. Take Samuel to the root cellar. This is about to get ugly. But Elena shook her head, her hands moving in rapid signs. No more running, no more hiding. This is our home, our choice. Mrs. Garrett smiled grimly. Smart woman. She raised her voice to carry outside. Boys, I think these gentlemen were just leaving. Why don't you help them remember the way? The sound of rifles being cocked echoed from the yard, and Blackwood's face went white. He'd come expecting to intimidate a lone rancher and his deaf wife. Instead, he'd walked into a trap set by people who'd been fighting this war much longer than Jake had known it existed. This isn't over, Blackwood snarled as he backed toward the door. No, Mrs. Garrett agreed. It's just beginning. But now Jake and Elena Morrison know what they're fighting for. The sound of Blackwood's retreat, boots scraping against broken wood, muttered curses, the creak of saddle leather as his men mounted up, faded into the distance like a storm passing overhead. But the silence that followed felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Jake stood in his ruined kitchen, still gripping his Colt, watching Mrs. Garrett's weathered face as she surveyed the damage. They'll be back, she said, matter-of-factly, setting her rifle against the wall. Blackwood's employer doesn't give up easy, and that music box represents more money than most men see in a lifetime. Her eyes found Samuel, who still stood protectively near Elena. The question is whether you folks understand what you've just signed up for. Elena's hands moved in rapid signs, and Jake found himself translating without thinking. She wants to know about the other children, the ones who were bought. Mrs. Garrett's expression darkened. Collector named Aldrich Crane. Runs what he calls an Institute for Exceptional Youth back east. Sounds respectable enough until you learn he's been acquiring children with unusual abilities for 15 years. Some see the future, some heal with touch, some commune with animals. Her gaze shifted to the music box. Samuel's the first I've encountered who can awaken lost senses. Jake felt Elena's hand tremble in his. The weight of what they'd stumbled into was settling over them like dust from the approaching storm he could see building on the horizon. They'd thought they were protecting one lost boy, but they'd actually declared war against something vast and organized. How many children has he taken? Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dozens. Maybe more. Mrs. Garrett moved to the window, her trained eyes scanning the perimeter. Crane has money, influence, judges in his pocket. He finds children with gifts, manufactures legal guardianships, and spirits them away to his institute. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the children have vanished into his collection. Samuel moved closer to the music box, his small hands hovering over its surface with protective reverence. When he spoke, his voice carried a pain that made Jake's chest tight. There were others at the institute. Sarah could make plants grow with her tears. Michael could speak to the dead. His dark eyes met Jake's. Crane made us perform for visitors. Rich men who paid to see miracles. The words hit Jake like physical blows. He looked at Elena, whose face had gone pale as she processed this new horror. She signed rapidly, and Jake translated her urgent question. She asks what happened to the other children. "I don't know," Samuel whispered. "Some got sick. Some just stopped, like their gifts burned out from being used too much." His voice broke. "Sarah couldn't make anything grow anymore before I escaped. She just cried regular tears." Mrs. Garrett's jaw tightened. "That's what Crane does. He uses these children up like candles, then finds new ones to replace them." Samuel got out because he was clever and desperate. But there are others still trapped. Elena suddenly moved to the music box and placed her hands on its carved surface. When she looked at Jake, her eyes held a fierce determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her. Her hands moved with deliberate slowness. "We can't let him take Samuel back to that place. Ever. Even if it means giving up everything we've built here?" Jake asked gently. "Because that's what this choice means. Elena Blackwood will come back with more men, more legal papers, more threats. We'll be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." Elena's response was immediate and unequivocal. Some things matter more than safety. Mrs. Garrett watched this exchange with growing respect. "You folks have backbone, I'll give you that. But backbone won't be enough against what's coming. Crane's got resources that stretch from here to Washington. He'll bring territorial marshals, federal judges, maybe even army units if he has to." "Then what do you suggest?" Jake asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "We make a stand," Mrs. Garrett replied. "Not just for Samuel, but for all of them. Every child Crane's collected, every gift he's perverted, every family he's destroyed." She looked directly at Elena. "Your wife heard music for the first time yesterday. That's a miracle worth fighting for. But imagine if Crane gets his hands on that music box. He'll use it to torture deaf children by giving them hearing just long enough to take it away again." The horrific possibility hung in the air like smoke. Jake watched Elena's face transform as she understood the implications. The gift that had brought such joy to their lives could become an instrument of unimaginable cruelty in the wrong hands. Samuel suddenly stepped forward, his young face set with grim determination. "I won't run anymore," he said, his voice stronger than Jake had ever heard it, "and I won't let him hurt anyone else." Outside, thunder rumbled across the drought-scorched landscape, promising a storm that might bring relief or devastation. Jake looked at his wife, at the boy who'd chosen to call them family, at the music box that had changed everything. They were no longer just protecting a miracle. They were preparing for war. The storm broke at dawn. Jake woke to the sound of rain hammering the roof. The first real precipitation redemption Falls had seen in 8 months, but instead of relief, the downpour filled him with dread. Weather that had refused to come during the worst of the drought now arrived to mask the approach of their enemies. He found Elena already awake beside him, her hand pressed against the window as she felt the vibrations of thunder through the glass. The wonder in her eyes at experiencing storm sounds for the first time was shadowed by the same fear that had kept Jake staring at the ceiling most of the night. "They'll use the storm as cover," he said quietly, and Elena nodded. She'd been learning to read his lips when the music box wasn't playing, determined to master every form of communication now available to her. Samuel appeared in their doorway, the wooden music box clutched against his chest like armor. Dark circles under his eyes revealed he'd slept as poorly as Jake. "Mrs. Garrett's men are already in position," the boy reported. "They spotted riders moving through the valley about an hour ago." Jake's blood chilled. "How many?" "At least 20. Maybe more. The rain makes it hard to count." Samuel's young face held a gravity that no child should possess. "Mrs. Garrett says Crane himself is with them." She recognized his carriage. The collector had come personally. Jake understood what that meant. No more pretense of legal proceedings or civilized negotiations. Crane wanted his prize back, and he'd brought an army to claim it. Elena rose and moved to the chest where they kept Jake's father's war rifle, a Confederate Whitworth that had seen action at Gettysburg. Her hands shook as she lifted the weapon, not from fear but from the weight of decision. She signed to Jake. "How many bullets do we have?" "Not enough," Jake answered honestly. "Elena, you need to take Samuel and get to the root cellar. Mrs. Garrett's people and I can hold them off long enough for—" Elena's sharp gesture cut him off. Her hands moved with fierce precision. "I will not hide while my family fights for our home. I can shoot, I can reload, I can watch the windows you cannot." Samuel stepped between them, his voice cutting through their silent argument. "There's something else. Something Mrs. Garrett didn't want to tell you last night." The boy's face was pale but resolute. "Crane doesn't just want the music box back. He wants to study why it worked on Elena. He thinks if he can understand how her hearing was restored, he can create more boxes, make more miracles to control." The horrible logic hit Jake like a physical blow. Elena wasn't just a witness to Samuel's gift. She was evidence of its power, proof that the impossible could be made real. In Crane's hands, she would become another specimen to be examined, tested, used until her newly awakened senses were destroyed. "He'll never stop hunting us," Jake realized. "Even if we gave him Samuel and the box, he'd still come for Elena." "That's why Mrs. Garrett says we have to end this here," Samuel replied. Crane's brought most of his operation with him. Guards, papers, even some of his other children to use as leverage. If we can stop him today, we break his power completely. Thunder crashed overhead, so close Elena gasped at the sound. Through the rain-lashed window, Jake could see dark shapes moving between the cottonwoods that marked the edge of his property. They were being surrounded with military precision. Elena's hand found Jake's arm, her touch gentle but urgent. When he met her eyes, she signed slowly, deliberately. "I have lived 24 years in silence. If I die today, I die having heard your voice tell me you love me. That is enough." But Jake knew it wasn't enough. Not the life growing in her belly. Not the boy who'd chosen them as family. Not the miracle they'd been given and now had to defend. He thought of his father's words about protecting what was yours. But this went beyond ownership or even responsibility. This was about the right of miracles to exist in a world that wanted to cage them. A rifle shot cracked through the storm, followed by Mrs. Garrett's voice shouting orders to her men. The battle had begun, and Jake Morrison, who'd spent his life fighting drought and debt and the daily struggle of survival, now faced his greatest enemy, a man who collected children's souls and called it science. Elena checked the action on the Whitworth with hands that no longer trembled. Samuel wound the music box, filling their small home with melody that seemed to strengthen them all. Outside, Aldrich Crane's forces closed in through the rain, bringing with them the full weight of corrupted law and stolen authority. Jake picked up his Colt and moved toward the window. Everything he'd learned about protecting his family, about standing against impossible odds, about the difference between surviving and living, would be tested in the next few hours. The ordeal had begun, and there would be no retreat. The first volley shattered the kitchen window, sending glass cascading across the floor where Samuel had first played the music box. Jake dove, pulling Elena down as rifle fire erupted from 3 directions at once. The coordinated assault spoke of military training. These weren't hired guns, but professional soldiers following a carefully orchestrated plan. "They're trying to pin us down while the main force moves in," Jake shouted over the gunfire, his voice barely audible above the storm and bullets. He fired twice through the broken window, rewarded by a cry of pain from the cottonwoods. Elena had positioned herself at the side window with the Whitworth, her newly awakened hearing allowing her to track approaching footsteps through the rain. When she fired, the heavy rifle's boom filled their small home with smoke and thunder. A man's scream cut through the storm. Her shot had found its mark. But for every attacker they dropped, 2 more seemed to take his place. Samuel crouched in the corner, clutching the music box while bullets splintered the walls around him. His young face was white with terror, but his grip on their miracle never wavered. "Mrs. Garrett's position is being overrun," Samuel called out, his voice breaking. "I can hear her men falling back." Through the chaos, Jake caught sight of their true enemy. Aldrich Crane stood beneath a black umbrella in the distance, watching the battle with detached interest, while his forces systematically destroyed Jake's defenses. The man was tall and thin, wearing an expensive suit that seemed obscene in the violence he'd orchestrated. Even from 50 yards away, Jake could see the cold calculation in Crane's eyes. This was simply another acquisition, another problem to be solved through superior firepower. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the splintering of wood as someone broke down their front door. Jake spun, firing at the first shadow through the doorway, but more figures poured in behind it. In seconds, their home was invaded by armed men in dark coats, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. "Elena, get to Samuel!" Jake roared, but it was too late. One of the intruders had circled behind them, emerging from their own bedroom with a rifle trained on Elena's back. Jake's world slowed as he watched the man's finger tighten on the trigger, Elena unaware of the threat as she reloaded the Whitworth. Jake threw himself between them, feeling the bullet punch through his left shoulder like liquid fire. The impact spun him sideways, his Colt flying from suddenly nerveless fingers. Blood spread across his shirt in a crimson stain that darkened in the rain still pouring through the broken windows. "Jake!" Elena's voice, the first time he'd heard her speak his name aloud, cut through everything else. She dropped the rifle and reached for him, but rough hands seized her arms, dragging her away from his fallen form. Samuel tried to run to them, but another intruder snatched the boy up like a sack of grain. The music box tumbled from Samuel's grip, its wooden surface cracking against the floorboards. The melody that had filled their home with wonder died in a discordant jangle of broken notes. Jake struggled to rise, but his wounded shoulder screamed in protest. Blood loss was making the room spin around him. Through the pain, he watched helplessly as Crane himself stepped through their destroyed doorway, his polished boots crunching on broken glass. "Mr. Morrison," Crane said with false politeness, his cultured voice carrying traces of Boston refinement. "I do apologize for the unpleasantness. This could have been resolved much more civilly if you'd simply cooperated." Elena fought against the men holding her, signing frantically, her movements sharp with desperation and fury. But without the music box's melody, she couldn't hear Jake's voice, couldn't understand Crane's words. She was trapped again in silence, cut off from the world of sound that had been hers for such a brief, precious time. "The woman fascinates me," Crane continued, studying Elena like a specimen. "To restore hearing that never existed, that suggests neural pathways far more complex than I initially theorized. She'll be invaluable to my research." "Leave her alone," Jake gasped, forcing himself up on one elbow. "Take the boy, take the box, but leave my wife out of this." Crane's laugh was cultured and completely without warmth. "Oh, Mr. Morrison, you misunderstand the scope of my interests. The box is merely a tool. The boy is gifted but replaceable. Your wife, however, represents proof of concept, evidence that the impossible can be made real." His cold eyes gleamed. "She's worth more to science than both of them combined." Jake watched in horror as they carried Elena and Samuel toward the door. His family, his miracle, was being torn away, and he was powerless to stop it. The wound in his shoulder was bleeding faster now, weakness spreading through his limbs like poison. Outside, Mrs. Garrett's resistance had finally collapsed. Through the broken window, Jake could see her surviving men being rounded up by Crane's forces. Their war was lost before it had truly begun. The music box lay shattered on his floor, its magic silenced forever. Elena's voice calling his name echoed in his memory, the last sound of wonder in a world suddenly gone dark. The silence that followed was more complete than any Jake had ever known. Not just the absence of gunfire or Elena's voice, but the terrible quiet of a life stripped bare of everything that mattered. Blood pooled beneath his wounded shoulder as he stared at the broken music box, its splintered wood scattered like the remains of their shattered dreams. But as his vision began to blur from blood loss, Jake saw something that made him forget his pain entirely. The music box wasn't completely destroyed. The ornate brass mechanism at its heart lay exposed among the wooden fragments, still intact but separated from its housing. And from that mechanism, barely visible in the storm-darkened room, came the faintest glimmer of light, not reflected illumination, but something emanating from within the metal itself. Jake dragged himself across the floor, leaving a trail of blood on the boards where Elena had first heard music. His fingers closed around the brass mechanism, and the moment his skin made contact, the world exploded with impossible sensation. Suddenly, he could feel every living thing for miles around. Elena's terror and confusion as she was carried through the rain. Samuel's desperate struggle against his captors, even Mrs. Garrett's fierce determination as she fought her way free from Crane's men. The connection was overwhelming, a flood of emotions and sensations that threatened to drown his consciousness entirely. But more than that, Jake could sense the truth that had been hidden from them all. The music box had never been the source of the miracle. It was Samuel himself. The boy's gift didn't require the wooden container at all. The music box had simply been a focus, a way for Samuel to channel and direct an ability that came from within his own spirit. Jake understood now why Crane's other children had burned out and faded. The collector had been forcing them to use external tools and artificial constraints, slowly severing their connection to the natural source of their gifts. Samuel didn't know. The boy believed his power was tied to the music box because that's how he'd first learned to use it. But the brass mechanism in Jake's hands was singing with the resonance of Samuel's own spirit, and more shocking still, it was responding to Jake's touch because he carried something similar within himself. The revelation hit him like lightning. Elena's pregnancy, the unborn child growing within her, their baby carried the same gift Samuel possessed. That's why the music box had worked so powerfully on Elena. It wasn't just restoring her hearing, it was awakening the latent ability their child had inherited from Jake's own bloodline. His father's voice echoed from memory. "We Morrisons have always been able to hear what others couldn't." Jake had dismissed it as frontier nonsense, but now he understood. His family carried the gift in their blood, passed down through generations but dormant until awakened by proximity to others like Samuel. Elena's pregnancy had made her sensitive to the boy's power. And their unborn child. Jake's heart raced as he realized what this meant. Crane didn't just want Elena as a test subject. If the collector suspected what was growing within her, he would never let either of them go. Through the brass mechanism, Jake could feel Crane's thoughts as the man supervised the loading of prisoners into his carriage. The collector's mind was cold and calculating, but beneath that clinical exterior lurked an obsession that bordered on madness. He'd spent 15 years gathering children with gifts, but he'd never encountered anything like what he'd found in Redemption Falls. The combination of Samuel's raw ability, Elena's miraculous transformation, and the implications of what their unborn child might become had consumed Crane's imagination entirely. Jake forced himself to his feet, the brass mechanism clutched against his chest. Blood loss made his legs unsteady. But the connection to Samuel's gift was strengthening him, feeding him power he'd never known he possessed. He could sense Mrs. Garrett rallying her surviving men for one final assault, could feel Elena's desperate attempts to reach Samuel through their shared captivity. But most importantly, he could sense the location of every one of Crane's forces, their positions as clear as if they were marked on a map in his mind. The broken music box on his floor suddenly seemed like a blessing rather than a tragedy. Crane believed he was taking the source of the miracle with him, but the true power had never been in the wooden container. It lived in Samuel's spirit, in Jake's bloodline, in the unborn child who would grow up to possess gifts that made all their abilities seem small by comparison. Jake Morrison had spent his life protecting his ranch, his cattle, his small corner of the world. Now he understood that everything, the drought, the isolation, even Crane's arrival, had been leading to this moment. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a man awakening to his true nature, and he had a war to win. The brass mechanism pulsed against Jake's chest like a second heartbeat, its warmth spreading through his wounded body with each labored breath. Blood still seeped from his shoulder, but the connection to Samuel's gift was doing more than lending him strength. It was teaching him things he'd never imagined possible. Through the mechanism, Jake could feel Mrs. Garrett moving through the storm like a ghost made of fury and determination. 3 of her men had survived Crane's assault, and they were regrouping in the old mine shaft 2 miles east of his ranch. She wasn't retreating. She was preparing for a counterattack that would give Jake the opening he needed. But first, he had to reach them. Jake staggered to his feet, wrapping his father's war rifle in an oilcloth, along with every cartridge he could carry. The brass mechanism went into a leather pouch against his heart, its presence immediately calming the chaos of sensations flooding his awakened perception. He could still feel Elena's terror as Crane's carriage bounced through the muddy valley, could sense Samuel's desperate attempts to break free from his bonds, but the overwhelming flood had become manageable streams of information. His shoulder screamed in protest as he saddled Thunder, his massive stallion snorting and stamping in agitation. The horse could sense the change in his master, the awakening power that made every movement crackling with barely contained energy. Jake pulled himself into the saddle through sheer force of will, gritting his teeth against the waves of pain that threatened to topple him back to the ground. The ride to the mine shaft should have taken 30 minutes. Jake made it in 15, pushing Thunder through ravines and creek beds that no sane man would attempt in daylight, let alone during a storm. But his new perception guided them around every obstacle, warned him of every loose stone that might betray their approach to Crane's scattered sentries. Mrs. Garrett emerged from the mine entrance before he'd even dismounted, her weathered face grim with purpose. "Jake Morrison, you look like death warmed over," she said, but her eyes held grudging respect. "Figured you'd be bleeding out on your kitchen floor by now." "The fight's not over," Jake replied, sliding down from Thunder's back. His legs nearly buckled, but the brass mechanism's warmth steadied him. "Crane thinks he's won, but he doesn't understand what he's really dealing with." "None of us understood," said a familiar voice from the mine's depths. Jake spun, nearly losing his balance as Samuel stepped into the grey stormlight. The boy was soaked and shivering, his clothes torn from his escape, but his eyes blazed with newfound understanding. "You felt it too, didn't you? When the box broke, you got away from them," Jake breathed, relief flooding through him. "The music box was never the source," Samuel continued, his young voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "It was just teaching me to focus what was already inside. But when it shattered, when you touched the mechanism..." The boy's eyes widened. "Your family carries the gift. That's why Elena could hear the music. That's why your child will be more powerful than any of us," Jake finished. "Crane suspects, doesn't he?" Samuel's nod was grim. "He's taking Elena to his camp in Devil's Canyon, not just as a test subject, but as bait. He knows you'll come, and he wants to study your gift too. He thinks if he can understand how the power passes through bloodlines, he can breed it. Control it." Mrs. Garrett spat into the mud. "Man's talking about people like they're livestock. Some things deserve killing on principle." Through the brass mechanism, Jake could feel Crane's carriage reaching the canyon, could sense Elena's growing desperation as she was transferred to a heavily guarded camp. But he could also feel something else. The 36 men Crane had positioned throughout the valley, the weapons caches hidden in strategic locations, the elaborate trap being set with military precision. "He's got us outnumbered 10-1, Jake said, "and he's chosen his ground well. Devil's Canyon only has 2 ways in or out." "Which is why we're not going to attack the canyon," Mrs. Garrett replied with a wolf's smile. "We're going to make him come to us." She led them deeper into the mine, where her surviving men were preparing something that made Jake's blood quicken with possibility. Dynamite. Enough to bring down half the mountain if necessary. "Crane's got one weakness," Mrs. Garrett explained. "He's greedy. He wants you alive, wants to study your gift. If we make him think he can capture all of us at once, we turn his trap into ours," Jake realized. The brass mechanism grew warm against his chest, and suddenly he could see the plan with crystalline clarity. The old mining camp at Widow's Peak. "It's defensible, but it looks like a dead end." Samuel's eyes lit with understanding. "If we make enough noise, show enough power, Crane will bring everything he has to take us alive," Jake finished, "including Elena." The plan was desperate, borderline suicidal, But as thunder crashed overhead and the brass mechanisms sang with Samuel's unleashed power, Jake Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced since Elena first heard music: hope. The storm was breaking as they rode toward Widow's Peak, but Jake Morrison felt as though he was riding into the heart of thunder itself. The brass mechanism against his chest hummed with power that made his wounded shoulder ache less and his vision sharper than it had ever been. Behind him, Mrs. Garrett's men guided pack horses loaded with enough dynamite to reshape the mountain, while Samuel rode at his side, the boy's gift flowing between them like an invisible current. Through the mechanism's connection, Jake could feel Elena's presence in Devil's Canyon. Her confusion, her fear, but also her fierce determination to protect their unborn child. Crane had her imprisoned in what felt like a medical tent, surrounded by instruments and restraints that made Jake's blood burn with rage. The Collector was preparing for experiments that would determine not just Elena's fate, but the future of their bloodline. "He's moving," Samuel said suddenly, his young face pale with concentration. "Crane's pulling back half his guards from the canyon. Someone told him we're at the mining camp." Mrs. Garrett's harsh laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "My surviving boys in town know how to spread the right rumors. Nothing travels faster than gossip about Jake Morrison making his last stand." The old mining camp at Widow's Peak was a perfect trap, disguised as a desperate mistake. 3 wooden buildings clustered around a played-out silver mine, with steep canyon walls on 2 sides and only one apparent escape route, a narrow trail that could be easily blocked. To any military mind, it looked like the choice of men with nowhere else to run. But Mrs. Garrett's miners had spent the morning preparing surprises that would turn Crane's advantage into catastrophe. Explosive charges were set into the canyon walls, positioned to create avalanches that would bottle up attacking forces. The mine shaft itself had been rigged to collapse, sealing off what Crane would assume was their final hiding place while actually opening a secret passage to the other side of the mountain. Jake dismounted at the camp's edge, his legs steadier now as Samuel's power continued to flow through the mechanism. The connection between them was growing stronger, teaching him things about his own nature that defied everything he'd believed about the world. His father's stories about Morrison family gifts weren't frontier superstition. They were echoes of abilities that had been sleeping in his bloodline for generations. "Elena's moving," he said, feeling his wife's presence shift through the mechanism's perception. "Crane's bringing her personally. He wants to witness whatever he thinks is going to happen here." Mrs. Garrett checked her rifle's load with practiced efficiency. Man's arrogance will be the death of him. He's so convinced he understands everything that he can't see the trap we're laying. Through the brass mechanism, Jake could sense the approaching force with stunning clarity. Crane was indeed bringing most of his men, confident that superior numbers would overwhelm whatever desperate resistance awaited him. The Collector traveled in an armored carriage with Elena as his prize, while 24 armed riders flanked the procession, and another dozen moved to block the escape route. But Crane had made a crucial miscalculation. He believed he was facing ordinary men driven to desperate measures, not understanding that Samuel's awakening gift had fundamentally changed the nature of their opposition. The boy could sense every heartbeat, every weapon, every tactical decision before Crane's forces made them. "They'll reach the canyon mouth in 20 minutes, Samuel reported, his voice steady despite his youth. "Crane's in the 3rd carriage. Elena's with him, but she's not restrained. He thinks her deafness makes her helpless." Jake's hand tightened on his rifle. Crane's assumption about Elena's limitations would prove to be another fatal error. The brass mechanism's connection flowed both ways. If Jake could sense Elena's presence, then she could feel his approaching power. And Elena Morrison had spent her entire life compensating for perceived weaknesses by developing strengths that others couldn't imagine. "Mrs. Garrett," Jake said, his voice carrying new authority that made even the hardened mine owner look up sharply. "When this starts, it's going to be unlike any fight you've seen before. The gifts Samuel and I carry, they change everything about how battles work." "How so?" "We'll know where every enemy is, what they're planning before they do it. But more than that," Jake touched the mechanism, feeling its warmth spread through his consciousness. We can coordinate like no military force has ever coordinated before. When I give the word to trigger those charges, it won't be guesswork about timing." Samuel nodded, his young face grave with understanding. "And if we can get close enough to Elena, if the connection reaches her through their child—" 3 Morrison gifts working together, Jake finished. Crane won't know what hit him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, and Jake Morrison felt the moment arriving when 15 years of careful plans would collide with powers that Crane had never truly comprehended. The final confrontation was beginning, and this time, Jake wasn't just fighting to save his family. He was fighting to claim his true inheritance. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off Widow's Peak like drums announcing an execution. Jake Morrison pressed his back against the weathered wood of the mining camp's main building, the brass mechanism burning against his chest as Crane's forces moved into position below. Through Samuel's gift flowing between them, he could see the entire battlefield laid out like a chess game, where he finally understood all the pieces. Crane's carriage had stopped just beyond rifle range, the collector's confidence evident in how casually he'd positioned himself. 24 riders spread across the canyon floor in a textbook cavalry formation, while another squad moved to seal the narrow escape trail. They expected desperate men making a final stand. They had no comprehension they were walking into the convergence of powers that could reshape the very nature of warfare. "Elena's aware," Samuel whispered, his young voice tight with concentration. "She can feel the connection through her child. She knows we're here." Through the mechanism, Jake sensed his wife's sudden alertness inside Crane's armored carriage. The collector had brought her to witness what he believed would be the capture of the remaining Morrison gifts, but Elena was no passive observer. 24 years of compensating for deafness had taught her to read situations through vibration, body language, and instincts that hearing people never developed. She was already moving, already planning. Mrs. Garrett crouched beside the first explosive trigger, her weathered hands steady as stone. "You'll say when, Jake. But once we start this dance, there's no stopping till the music ends." Below them, Crane stepped from his carriage with theatrical confidence. Even at this distance, Jake could feel the man's cold satisfaction radiating through Samuel's enhanced perception. The collector had spent 15 years hunting children with gifts, confident that superior resources and careful planning could contain any supernatural ability. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. "Samuel," Jake said, his voice carrying new authority that surprised even himself. "When I give the word, I need you to extend your gift as far as it will reach. Don't hold back, don't try to control it. Let it flow through the mechanism to Elena and the baby." The boy's eyes widened with understanding and terror. That kind of connection, it could kill us all if we can't handle it. Or it could give us power that no military force in history has ever possessed. Jake checked his rifle's load, feeling the brass mechanism's warmth spread through his consciousness like liquid lightning. Crane thinks he understands what we can do because he studied children using their gifts in isolation. He's never seen what happens when 3 generations of the same bloodline work together. Through the enhanced perception, Jake could sense Crane's men moving into final position. They advanced with military precision, confident in their overwhelming numbers and superior equipment, but they moved like blind men stumbling through a world where their enemies could see every heartbeat, anticipate every decision, coordinate every response with supernatural unity. "Mrs. Garrett," Jake called softly, "target the canyon walls first. I want those avalanche charges to cut off their retreat before they realize what's happening. And then we show Crane what 15 years of underestimating the Morrison family gets him." Elena's presence flared through the connection, and Jake felt his wife's fierce determination as she prepared to act from within Crane's own carriage. The collector had made his most fatal miscalculation in bringing her close to the battle. He thought her deafness made her helpless, but Elena Morrison had spent her entire life turning perceived limitations into unexpected strengths. Samuel's gift suddenly exploded outward, flowing through the brass mechanism with power that made the air itself seem to sing. Jake felt the connection reach Elena and their unborn child, felt 3 generations of Morrison gifts linking together in ways that defied every natural law he'd ever accepted. For one crystalline moment, Jake could see everything. Every enemy position, every weapon, every tactical possibility spreading before them like branches on an infinite tree. Mrs. Garrett's explosive charges waited like sleeping thunder in the canyon walls. Elena's hands moved toward the carriage door's latch. Crane's riders advanced in perfect formation toward their own destruction. The collector himself stood in the open, his clinical mind cataloging what he expected to be the final capture of supernatural abilities he'd spent decades hunting. But the gifts he'd studied in isolation were nothing compared to what happened when they combined, multiplied, transformed into something greater than their individual parts. Jake Morrison raised his father's rifle, feeling power flow through him that turned every shot into certainty, every decision into tactical perfection. The boy beside him channeled gifts that could rewrite the nature of warfare itself. And in Crane's own carriage, Elena Morrison prepared to remind the world why underestimating a supposedly helpless woman was the last mistake her enemies would ever make. "Now," Jake whispered, and the brass mechanism erupted with light that could be seen for miles. The final test had begun, and Crane's careful plans were about to collide with powers he had never truly understood. The brass mechanism's light erupted like captured lightning, and the world exploded into chaos that transcended anything Crane had prepared for. Jake Morrison's first shot took down the lead rider before the man could even register the muzzle flash, while Mrs. Garrett's charges detonated in perfect sequence along the canyon walls. Thunder that had nothing to do with the storm shattered the air as tons of rock cascaded down, sealing Crane's retreat and trapping his forces in a killing ground they'd walked into blind. But the physical battle was only half the confrontation unfolding at Widow's Peak. Through Samuel's unleashed gift flowing between them, Jake felt Elena burst from Crane's carriage with deadly purpose, her hands finding weapons the collector's men had carelessly left within reach. 24 years of reading the world through vibration and instinct had taught her to move through combat like a dancer who could feel the rhythm of violence itself. "Impossible!" Crane's voice carried across the canyon, no longer coldly confident, but sharp with the first edge of fear Jake had ever heard from him. "They can't coordinate like this. No human ability extends that far." The collector was wrong on every level. This wasn't human ability in any sense he understood. 3 generations of Morrison bloodline were working as a single tactical mind, sharing perception and coordination that turned individual gifts into something that resembled divine intervention. Jake could feel Elena's every movement, anticipate Samuel's next surge of power, while the boy channeled their combined abilities through the mechanism until reality itself seemed to bend around their unified will. Jake's second shot shattered the rifle of a man who'd been aiming at Samuel, while his third found the explosives pack of another rider before the man could trigger it. But these weren't lucky shots or even skillful ones. They were manifestations of absolute tactical knowledge flowing through him from Samuel's gift. He could see every enemy action before it happened, coordinate Mrs. Garrett's charges before Crane's men could take cover, direct Elena's assault from inside their formation while she struck at targets Jake couldn't even see from his position. "Fall back!" one of Crane's sergeants shouted. "Reform at the canyon mouth!" But the canyon mouth was gone, sealed under Mrs. Garrett's avalanche, and the narrow escape trail was blocked by men Jake had positioned there through tactical prescience that bordered on prophecy. Crane's superior numbers meant nothing when his enemies could anticipate every movement, coordinate every response, strike at weak points before they'd even formed. Through the mechanism's blazing connection, Jake felt Crane himself drawing a weapon, not to join the fight, but to aim directly at Elena as she carved through his scattered forces. The collector's scientific detachment had shattered into rage at watching 15 years of careful planning destroyed by abilities he'd never comprehended. If he couldn't capture the Morrison gifts, he'd ensure they died with their carriers. "Elena!" Jake's warning carried across the battlefield just as Crane's pistol rose. But Elena Morrison had never needed to hear danger to sense it. She spun as Crane fired, the bullet meant for her heart instead shattering against the carriage's armored side. Her return strike came with a speed and precision that spoke to gifts awakening in her that went far beyond recovered hearing. The knife she'd taken from Crane's own guard found its target with supernatural accuracy, dropping the collector's weapon from nerveless fingers. "You think you understand power," Elena said, her voice carrying across the canyon with deadly clarity as she advanced on the man who'd threatened her unborn child. "You study it like specimens in jars, catalogue it like butterflies pinned to boards. But you've never faced what happens when love and family and 3 generations of Morrison blood decide you've gone far enough." Crane stumbled backward, his clinical composure completely shattered. Blood ran from his wounded hand while his surviving men retreated in growing panic from forces they couldn't begin to comprehend. The collector who'd spent decades hunting supernatural children was finally facing the true extent of abilities he'd only glimpsed in isolation. "This isn't possible," Crane gasped, pressing his back against his overturned carriage. "Individual gifts can't combine like this. There are natural limits, scientific boundaries." "Your science stops where our family begins," Jake called down from the mining camp's wall, his rifle trained on the man who'd terrorized them for 15 years. The brass mechanism blazed against his chest as Samuel's power flowed through him with intensity that made the air itself shimmer. "And you're about to learn what happens when you threaten a Morrison child." Elena stood over Crane now, her hand steady on the blade that could end this confrontation with a single strike. Through their supernatural connection, Jake felt his wife's fierce protectiveness warring with mercy she wasn't sure the collector deserved. Around them, Crane's surviving men threw down their weapons rather than face abilities that defied every military doctrine they'd ever learned. The final confrontation had become exactly what Crane feared most, a reckoning with powers he never truly understood, delivered by a family he'd spent 15 years underestimating. And in that moment of absolute defeat, Orson Crane finally comprehended the magnitude of his miscalculation. Elena's blade trembled against Crane's throat, poised to end 15 years of terror with a single motion. Through the blazing connection that linked all 3 Morrison generations, Jake felt his wife's internal struggle, the fierce desire for vengeance warring against something deeper, more terrible than simple mercy. "Do it!" Jake called down from the mining camp wall, his voice carrying all the rage and protection of a man who'd watched his family suffer. "End this. End him." But Elena's hand remained frozen, her eyes wide not with hesitation but with sudden, horrifying understanding. Through Samuel's gift flowing between them, she was seeing something that made her step back from the fallen collector with terror written across her face. "Jake," she whispered, her voice carrying across the canyon with supernatural clarity. "I can hear it. Through the baby. I can hear what happens if I kill him." The brass mechanism against Jake's chest suddenly burned with intensity that dropped him to his knees. Samuel cried out as power beyond anything they'd channeled before erupted through their connection, showing them all the terrible truth that Elena's enhanced perception had discovered first. Killing Crane wouldn't end the threat. It would trigger something infinitely worse. "The other children," Samuel gasped, his young face twisted with visions flowing through the gift they all shared. "He has dozens of them, scattered across 3 states. If his heartbeat stops, if the mechanism he carries goes silent." Jake felt the horrifying knowledge slam into his consciousness. Crane's network was vast, built over 15 years of systematic hunting, and he'd prepared for the possibility of his own death by creating dead man's switches that would activate the moment his heart stopped beating. Prison camps where gifted children would be slaughtered rather than allowed to escape. Explosive devices that would level entire communities suspected of harboring supernatural families. "You understand now." Crane wheezed from where he lay broken against his overturned carriage. Blood ran from his wounded hand, but his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a man playing his final, most devastating card. "Kill me, and 47 children die within the hour. Children whose only crime was being born with abilities you call gifts." Elena's knife fell from nerveless fingers. Through their connection, Jake felt her maternal instincts recoiling from the impossible choice: save her own family by damning dozens of other children to death, or spare the monster who'd terrorized them for 15 years. But the mechanism was showing them something even worse than Crane's immediate threat. Samuel's gift was reaching deeper into the collector's network, revealing the true scope of what they faced. This wasn't just about one man's obsession with supernatural children. It was about a larger organization, a conspiracy that viewed gifted bloodlines as resources to be harvested or threats to be eliminated. "The consortium," Jake whispered, the name flowing through their enhanced connection like poison. "Crane's just one collector among dozens. Even if we spare him, they'll send others," Elena finished, her voice hollow with the weight of impossible choice. "Stronger ones, better prepared." Samuel's gift suddenly flared beyond anything they'd experienced, showing them futures spreading out like branches on a tree of possibilities. Jake saw Elena growing old in hiding, their child never knowing safety or home. He saw other gifted families hunted down one by one as the consortium refined their methods. He saw a world where children like Samuel were caged and studied until their spirits broke completely. But he also saw another path, one that required a sacrifice so terrible it made Elena's choice about Crane seem simple by comparison. "There's a way," Samuel said, his voice ancient with knowledge no 12-year-old should possess. "But it means giving up everything. The connection between us, the gifts themselves, all of it has to be severed." Through the mechanism, Jake felt the truth of what the boy was proposing. They could destroy Crane's network, protect the captured children, ensure that no Morrison would ever be hunted again. But the price was the complete elimination of their gifts from the bloodline forever. Samuel would have to channel their combined abilities into a single devastating surge that would burn out their supernatural heritage entirely. No more enhanced perception, no more tactical prescience, no more connection flowing between them like shared consciousness. Elena would lose her miraculous hearing, returning to the silence she'd lived with for 24 years. Their unborn child would grow up normal, safe, but never knowing the incredible legacy they'd inherited and lost. And Samuel would sacrifice his gift entirely, becoming an ordinary boy with ordinary limitations, giving up the power that had awakened something magnificent in all of them. Elena's hand found Jake's across the supernatural connection that linked them. Through their shared consciousness, he felt his wife's decision before she spoke it aloud. "Do it," she said, her voice breaking with the weight of what they were choosing. "Save those children. End this forever." Jake Morrison looked at his wife, at the boy who'd given them miracles, at the enemies scattered before them in defeat. Victory was within their grasp, but keeping it would cost them everything that made the victory possible. The mechanism blazed with light as Samuel began to channel the last great gift the Morrison bloodline would ever know. The light that erupted from Samuel wasn't the controlled radiance they'd channeled before. It was a consuming fire that seemed to burn through the very fabric of reality. Jake felt the power tear through him like lightning made of liquid starfire, every supernatural sense he'd discovered blazing to impossible intensity before beginning to fade forever. Through their connection, he felt Elena's gasp as 24 years of newfound hearing crystallized into perfect, heartbreaking clarity, the sound of wind through canyon stone, the distant cry of hawks, the rhythm of her own pulse that she'd never known existed. For one precious moment, she could hear everything with supernatural precision. Then the gift began to burn away, taking with it the miraculous world of sound that Samuel had given her. But even as their abilities died, the mechanism was channeling their combined power across hundreds of miles. Jake felt the surge reach Crane's hidden facilities, prison camps disguised as orphanages, research stations masquerading as schools for the deaf. Locks opened, guards collapsed as their weapons mysteriously jammed, and 47 children who'd been caged for their gifts suddenly found themselves free, their supernatural abilities temporarily enhanced enough to ensure escape from captors who'd never expected organized resistance. "No," Crane whispered, watching his life's work crumble through the reports crackling on his damaged radio. 15 years. Gone, Elena said softly, though Jake could see in her eyes the growing silence as her supernatural hearing faded. Soon she would read lips again, rely on vibration and instinct rather than the miracle of sound. But her voice carried no regret, only fierce satisfaction. Every prison, every camp, every child you stole. The mechanism against Jake's chest was growing cold now, its brass surface losing the supernatural warmth that had connected 3 generations of Morrison gifts. Through their dying link, he felt Samuel's young consciousness already beginning to separate from theirs. The boy who'd arrived in a dust storm carrying impossible miracles was becoming simply a 12-year-old again, his ancient knowledge fading like dreams upon waking. But Samuel was smiling as the last of his gift burned away. "They're all free," he whispered, his voice no longer carrying the weight of supernatural awareness. "Every one of them. And the consortium's network, it's collapsing. Without Crane's research, without the children to study, they're just ordinary men with ordinary resources." Jake felt the final surge pass through them, carrying their combined abilities into one last, devastating strike. Somewhere in Washington, carefully hidden files were spontaneously combusting. Bank accounts funding the child-hunting network were mysteriously draining into legitimate orphanages, and the handful of other collectors who'd spent decades following Crane's methods suddenly found their supernatural prisoners beyond their ability to contain. Then silence fell over Widow's Peak. Not the supernatural quiet that had preceded their enhanced awareness, but the ordinary silence of a world where gifts had been sacrificed to purchase safety. Elena's hand found his without their mystical connection to guide it, simple human love replacing supernatural unity. Jake could no longer sense her thoughts, could no longer anticipate her movements, could no longer share the consciousness that had linked them during their brief time as something more than human. But when she smiled at him, he felt something deeper than any gift Samuel's music box could have awakened. "The baby," she said, pressing Jake's palm against her growing belly. "I can't hear its heartbeat anymore, but I can feel it, strong and safe and normal." Their child would grow up in Redemption Falls, never knowing the legacy of enhanced perception and tactical prescience that had once flowed through Morrison blood. But they would also grow up free from the terror that had driven Jake's family into 15 years of hiding. No consortium agents would come for them. No collectors would study them like specimens. They would be ordinary people, living ordinary lives in a world that could no longer hunt them for abilities they no longer possessed. Samuel stood beside Crane's broken form, looking more like the lost boy they'd first encountered than the supernatural force he'd revealed himself to be. "Will you take me home?" he asked Jake, his voice carrying only a child's hope rather than mystical knowledge. "To Redemption Falls? I think I'd like to learn to be just a regular boy." Jake nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. Not the brass mechanism's supernatural warmth, but the simpler satisfaction of a man who'd found his family's peace at last. Around them, Crane's surviving men were fleeing into the desert, their military precision dissolved without supernatural threats to contain. The collector himself lay motionless, his breathing shallow but steady. He would live, but his power was broken as thoroughly as the gifts that had defeated him. Mrs. Garrett emerged from the mining camp, her weathered face creased with wonder and loss. "I can't feel them anymore," she said quietly. "The children, the network, it's all just gone." "Good," Elena said, her voice already adapting to the growing silence as her supernatural hearing faded completely. Soon Jake would need to face her when he spoke, ensure she could read his lips. But they'd learned to love without miracles once before. They could learn again. The journey back to Redemption Falls took 3 days through terrain that looked different to eyes no longer enhanced by supernatural sight. Jake found himself squinting at distant ridges he'd once seen with perfect clarity, listening for sounds that his ordinary hearing couldn't quite catch. Beside him on the wagon seat, Elena watched the horizon with the focused attention she'd developed in her silent years, reading the world through vibration and visual cues, rather than the miraculous hearing that had blazed and died at Widow's Peak. Samuel rode in the wagon bed, wrapped in Mrs. Garrett's spare blanket, looking smaller somehow without the ancient knowledge that had made him seem ageless. The boy slept fitfully, occasionally muttering in his dreams, ordinary child's nightmares now rather than visions of supernatural networks spanning continents. The music box sat beside him, its brass surface tarnished and cold, just an antique toy that would never again awaken gifts in Morrison blood. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked on the second evening, as they camped beside a creek Jake remembered from his father's stories. She positioned herself where the firelight would illuminate her face, making it easier for him to read her lips in the growing darkness. Jake considered the question while watching Samuel sleep peacefully for what might be the first time since the boy had arrived in their lives. "No," he said finally, ensuring Elena could see his mouth clearly. "Those children are free. Our child will be safe. Samuel gets to be just a boy instead of carrying power that nearly destroyed him. That's worth more than any gift." Elena's smile carried the warmth he'd fallen in love with years before supernatural abilities had complicated their world. She took his hand, not guided by mystical connection now, but by the simple intimacy of two people who'd learned to communicate through touch and attention. "I keep expecting to hear your voice," she admitted. "It was wonderful, those few days of sound. But this feels more real somehow. More ours." On the third morning, they crested the familiar ridge that overlooked Redemption Falls. The town spread below them, exactly as Jake remembered from childhood. Weathered buildings clustered around the church steeple, the general store with its crooked sign, Doc Patterson's office with its perpetually overflowing rain barrel. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place that had harbored the Morrison family's secrets for 3 generations. Mrs. Patterson was hanging laundry when their wagon rolled down Main Street. She dropped her basket when she recognized Elena, running toward them with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Elena Morrison, we thought, when you disappeared so sudden." "We're home now," Elena said, climbing down from the wagon with the careful movements of a woman protecting her growing child. "And we're staying." Word spread through Redemption Falls with a speed that only small towns could manage. By evening, the Morrison cabin was filled with neighbors who'd worried for months about the young couple who'd vanished without explanation. They brought casseroles and preserved vegetables, hand-knitted baby clothes, and offers of help rebuilding whatever had brought Jake and Elena home, looking older than their years warranted. Samuel sat quietly in the corner, overwhelmed by the gentle chaos of community care. These people asked no questions about supernatural gifts or mysterious powers. They simply welcomed him as they would any child who needed shelter. When Mrs. Peterson offered to teach him letters and numbers with her own grandchildren, his grateful smile was entirely ordinary and completely genuine. "He'll need proper papers," Elena murmured to Jake as they watched Samuel tentatively accept a slice of Mrs. Henderson's apple pie. "A name, a history people can understand." "Samuel Morrison," Jake said without hesitation. "Our nephew from back east, come to live with us after his parents died of fever. Simple truth, mostly." Elena nodded, her hand finding his with the unconscious ease of long practice. Around them, their neighbors were already making room for Samuel in their mental map of the town's children. By next Sunday, he'd have a place in the church pew and chores assigned by the shopkeepers who looked after all of Redemption Falls' young people. Late that night, after the visitors had gone, and Samuel was sleeping deeply in the loft Jake's father had built for future grandchildren, Elena and Jake sat on their front porch watching stars that seemed both dimmer and more precious than they had during their brief time of enhanced perception. "Different," Elena said, her voice soft in the darkness. "What?" She turned so he could see her face in the moonlight. "You asked what I thought about coming home. We're different people than when we left. Not because of the gifts we lost, but because of what we chose to do with them." Jake nodded, understanding completely. They'd returned to the same town, the same house, even the same neighbors, but they carried themselves differently now, not as people hiding from the world, but as those who'd faced impossible choices and emerged with their values intact. Their love had been tested by miracles and sacrifices, and it had held. Inside the cabin, their unborn child grew safely in Elena's womb, ordinary, protected, and precious beyond measure. They were home. The baby came on a morning when spring rain drummed against the cabin roof with the steady rhythm Elena felt through the floorboards beneath her feet. Samuel, now 14 and tall enough to help Jake with the heavy ranch work, had ridden hard through the dawn storm to fetch Doc Patterson. By the time the old physician arrived, shaking water from his coat, Elena was already holding their daughter, a perfect, ordinary child with Jake's dark hair and lungs strong enough to announce her displeasure at the world's brightness. "She's beautiful," Doc Patterson said, checking the baby with gentle hands that had delivered 3 generations of Redemption Falls children. "Strong heartbeat, good color. You've got yourselves a healthy little girl." Jake cradled his daughter for the first time, marveling at how something so small could feel so monumentally important. No supernatural awareness enhanced this moment, just the overwhelming love of a father holding his child. When the baby's tiny fist wrapped around his finger, he felt more connected to the future than any mystical gift had ever made him feel. "Mary," Elena said, watching Jake's face transform with wonder, "after your mother." They'd chosen the name months ago, but hearing it spoken aloud made their daughter real in a way that went beyond the physical presence in Jake's arms. Mary Morrison would grow up knowing nothing of tactical prescience or supernatural hearing or ancient music boxes that awakened impossible gifts. She would learn to ride horses and tend cattle and read the weather from cloud formations, but her abilities would be earned through practice and attention rather than inherited through bloodline magic. Samuel peered over Jake's shoulder with the careful curiosity of a boy who'd learned to be gentle with fragile things. "Will she know?" he asked quietly. "About what we used to be able to do?" "Someday," Jake said. "When she's old enough to understand that some stories are true even when they sound impossible. But it'll be just a story to her, something that happened to other people in another time." The years that followed proved Jake right. Mary grew up in a Redemption Falls that prospered as the railroad finally reached their corner of Texas, bringing new families and opportunities that diluted the insularity that had once made supernatural secrets necessary. She learned to sign with her mother's graceful hands, to read the subtle visual cues that Elena navigated with unconscious skill. But she also grew up hearing the world, church bells and cattle lowing, and her father's deep laugh echoing across the ranch yard. Samuel became the brother Jake had never expected to have, the uncle Mary adored without reservation. He learned carpentry from Mr. Henderson and helped Jake expand their ranch house as prosperity and peace allowed for dreams beyond mere survival. Sometimes Jake caught glimpses of the ancient wisdom that had once burned through the boy's eyes, but mostly Samuel was simply who he'd chosen to be, a young man building an ordinary life with extraordinary gratitude. On Mary's 5th birthday, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing Mrs. Peterson's legendary chocolate cake, Elena caught Jake's eye across their daughter's excited chatter about the new pony Samuel had helped her name. In the look they shared, Jake saw the acknowledgement of everything they'd gained and lost and chosen. Their love had been tested by miracles and proven strongest in their absence. Elena would never again hear his whispered promises in the darkness, but she could feel his devotion in the gentle way he touched her shoulder when entering a room, ensuring she always knew he was there. Jake would never again anticipate her movements through supernatural connection, but he'd learned to communicate through attention and care that ran deeper than any mystical gift. The brass music box sat on the mantelpiece now, a family heirloom that would pass to Mary someday with a story about the mysterious boy who'd brought her parents together. She would wind it occasionally, delighting in the simple melody that emerged, never knowing it had once awakened miracles. To her, it would be just a pretty antique that reminded her of Uncle Samuel's arrival during a long-ago dust storm. As evening settled over the ranch and Mary fell asleep between them on the porch swing, Jake felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world. He was no longer the giant cowboy running from a family legacy he couldn't control. He was a husband, a father, a rancher whose biggest concerns involved cattle prices and weather patterns rather than supernatural conspiracies. Elena's hand found his in the darkness, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of 15 years together. "No regrets?" she asked, the question that had become their gentle ritual. "None," Jake answered, meaning it completely. Around them, Redemption Falls settled into peaceful sleep under stars that shone with ordinary beauty. Their daughter breathed softly against his chest, dreaming ordinary dreams. Samuel's light burned steady in the loft window, where he read ordinary books about ordinary adventures. They had traded miracles for safety, gifts for love, supernatural abilities for the simple blessing of home. It was, Jake Morrison knew with absolute certainty, the best bargain he'd ever made.